Hi, I'm George Mueller, and this is one of two videos that will serve as an introduction to Roman history for students in my 101 class. This video is going to focus on legal developments and the culture of Rome and a connection between the two. And the next one will deal with later political developments and threats to the Roman Republic. When you're looking at Rome, you need to look at Rome's location. It's almost in the center of the Mediterranean Ocean, or the Mediterranean Sea. That's an advantage because it's the perfect place to dominate trade and politics in a world that's focused on sea travel and on moving goods by water. Rome, however, wasn't the only city that had this advantage. There's going to be another one that we'll see a little later. Within the Roman Peninsula, the city of Rome itself is very advantageously located. It's not on the seaside. It's actually a few miles, just a little bit less than 20 miles inland, and that's important. It protects from pirate attacks. Now, we're not used to the kind of pirates that they had in the ancient world. Pirate attack was a threat to entire cities, with entire cities actually being attacked and sometimes up to 50% of the inhabitants carried off in giant raids. So being inland was a handy thing. Italy's geography is also important. In the north, the Alps cut it off from Europe. It's not an impenetrable border, but it makes it hard to get an army into Italy. That'll be important later. Within the peninsula of Italy, there are mountains that break it up and form natural borders, but they don't break it up as much as Greece had been broken up. So larger farms are going to be the standard within the Italian peninsula. And on that Italian peninsula, there's going to be a variety of groups. The oldest group are indigenous peoples related to the Bronze Age peoples who had been on the continent of Europe for millennia. But they're outnumbered by a newer group, the Latins. They're an Indo-European speaking group who appear roughly 1500 BCE. The Romans are going to be one of several Latin groups, and they form a distinct ethnicity up to the present day. Still have that terrible cough, sorry. Another group that's going to impact the Romans are the Etruscans. The Etruscans are a mysterious group. Genetically, we still don't know exactly who they're related to. They may have been a development from the indigenous peoples, or they may have moved from the Near East. Genetically, they're distinct. Their language was very distinct. They had a written language that we can't read today. And their art style, which you can see from this example here, was alien. It's very odd. Wherever they came from, they had advanced metallurgical skills, and they were a relatively organized group. And they ruled from a number of cities in the northern part of Italy, what's today known as the Tuscany area. And they actually dominated Rome, the city, for several hundred years. So they had a lot of influence on Rome. Now, according to legend, Rome was founded by Romulus and Remus, who were two brothers who escaped the fall of Troy. Whatever the case, the actual people who populated the city of Rome were Latins, a particular tribe of Latins. Early on, they had a monarchy, like so many other places, including the Etruscans, and may have had Etruscan kings. Eventually, though, the Etruscans are thrown out, and a republic is formed. The Roman Republic is very interesting, partly because it's very similar to modern American Republic and many other modern nations, but it's not quite the same. For example, the Roman executive branch is formed of a number of officials, the most important of whom were the consuls. Consuls were the people who ran the army in times of war, and during times of peace, they served as essentially a pair of presidents. Under them were the praetors. The praetors were in charge of understanding the law and interpreting and applying it. So the executive branch had the power both to apply laws and to interpret them. It's very distinct from the modern U.S. The Roman Senate, which gives its name to the American Senate, was somewhat different than the modern institution. The Roman Senate had 300 men who served lifetime terms in the Senate, but they had no power to actually make laws. Instead, they debated topics and made recommendations. Laws were actually made by a series of popular assemblies, and their exact number and constitution changed over time. A good example is the Centurion Assembly, which is based on socioeconomic and military class. Because early on in the Roman Republic, just like they had in Greece, men were expected to buy their own weapons for war, and the army was actually made up not of professionals, but of the public. The Roman public was broken into two groups. One was the patricians. These are relatively wealthy. It's a set group of families, and they're given political and legal and economic rights that the rest of the public doesn't have. The plebeians were everybody else. This is the poor and the middle class. Over time, the problem became that wealth was building up due to trade in this middle class, just like it had in Greece. And they didn't have political power to go along with it. And also the poor were increasingly dissatisfied. This began to affect the Roman military because, well, the poor didn't have enough money to afford to buy arms and equipment to serve in the military. So even that out wasn't available to them. Eventually, they'll react to this by going on strike a number of times. The textbook is going to be a good source for that complicated but important story. It'll also help explain part of why the U.S. government is set up the way it is. Now, part of the reason that the Roman government was set up this way is that it's based on their understanding of the Roman family. In the Roman family, the eldest male had absolute control over the family. He's called the paterfamilias, and he had literal power of life and death. That's right. No matter how old you were, as long as your father was alive, he controlled you. He could sell you into slavery, he could execute you, and not commit a crime. So that's significant, especially given that the Romans had arranged marriages. Now later on, later on, divorce will become very common in the Roman world, at least as common as in modern America. During the early Republican era, wives were considered to become property of their husband. This had some legal disadvantages for women. If they owned property through their family, they lost it. In the result of a divorce, well, the husband kept it, along with the children. Later, a new system worked out where during a divorce, during a wedding, a wife would stay property of her father. It was essentially kind of lent out. Now, this had some advantages for women. As the textbook notes, in the case of divorce, she kept her own property, and this could be very advantageous. On the other hand, it does mean if her father's alive, she was still his property. And there were many cases of fathers deciding they were done with that political alliance and they wanted to form another one. And you could, as a father, force your daughter to divorce her husband, no matter how long they'd been married, and marry someone else, and she had no say. That happened to, for example, Julius Caesar's niece, who had been married off to a man that she quite liked. She was forced to divorce him and marry someone else who she did not like. and then forced to divorce him and 3 other men before eventually her father died, and then she was able to marry back the first person she'd been married to. An interesting system. Glad we don't still do it. Now, the last part of the Roman family is slaves. And slavery was very common in Rome. And during the course of the Roman Republic, as Rome goes to war, it's going to become more and more common. You could become a slave in Rome if you committed certain crimes, angered your father, if your father went into debt, or if you were on the losing side of a war or a battle or a revolt. Slaves made up to 30% of the population of Rome. And that's a really high percentage to have of slaves. For example, at the highest point in American history in 1800, slaves in the U.S. made up about 18% of the population. And it dropped from there till the Civil War. So lots of slaves, and that will be an issue. Now, in terms of the law evolving, not only did the type of marriage evolve over time, there was definitely a pattern of setting down laws and making them more and more approachable and categorized, making them much more professional. The 12 tables of law had been put together by 450 BCE, and this is the first time in Europe that you have the law set down like this. Praetors had the job of writing down and explaining how they were going to interpret the law. And this creates a body of law that could be studied. And there were a number of people who did study it. The Romans also developed the idea of the law of nations. And that's an idea that you have laws that apply to just Romans within Rome, but then you also have laws that apply to Romans' interaction with non-Romans. And eventually they developed the idea that this law was based on universal reason, that you reasoned out how these laws worked and they would work like that forever. And this really develops the idea of natural law that will hold sway in Western legal traditions all the way through the 1950s. Its replacement is still being developed now. The last thing I'm going to mention in this video is how the Romans came to conquer Italy. And our source on this is the historian Livy. What we do know is that the Romans had been fighting other Italians almost since the founding of the city. But by about 340 BCE, the Romans had really conquered the other Italian peoples, the other Latins. And these weren't wars to destruction. These were wars to political domination. And these were people who the Romans were literally intermarrying with and culturally identical to. So there was no question of destroying them. Instead, the Romans formed a confederation. If you lived very close to Rome, you got citizenship right away. You're basically a Roman. Other Italian peoples were given the position as an ally, and they would gain, if their nation or their city served the Romans well, the idea was you would gain citizenship. And this really allowed the Romans to take this ethnic idea of citizenship and make it almost, well, modernly multicultural, because they can apply citizenship to other people. The other thing the Romans are going to do as a result of their conquests is build roads. The roads will go on and on throughout the empire, and this will be one of the really enduring things that the Romans do. It also shows how the Romans are founding not only military conquest, but they're founding a pattern of trade, and that'll be important later on. So if you like this video, you can subscribe, and I have I don't have a Patreon. I'm your teacher, not just a YouTuber. So if you have any questions, contact me. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.